Well, good morning. Our gospel lesson was about the disciples walking up a mountain, so I kind of went on a stretch and picked a joke about that, so I hope you like it. They say that Bible scholars have decided that the disciples had a car. Do you know what kind of car it was? Please don't answer if you know. It was a Honda, because the Bible said of the disciples they were in one accord. So what it says in the Bible. So you can look that up. Today is Transfiguration Sunday, a day that I have trouble with. I don't know about you, but Transfiguration, I always have to look that word up and remember what it means and think about what it means. It's a time when we see something differently. And then in all of our readings this morning, we heard about glory. And I kept thinking about glory and what that means. And glory is really reflected. Well, it's the light of radiance, I guess. And so I've been wrestling with that. And I'm a bit of a movie fan and a bit of a nerd at that. And so a lot of my imagery comes from those kind of stories. And I have enjoyed these movies, the Men in Black, the science fiction movies. I don't know if you guys like those or saw them. And if you didn't, I apologize. But there's two kind of space cops. Well, they're on Earth, but they're dealing with aliens. They're kind of cops. It's sort of a cop buddy show. And it's Will Smith, and he's sort of funny and comedic and young. And Tommy Lee Jones, who's kind of the old veteran and grizzly. And someone was interviewing Tommy Lee Jones about his role in those movies, and they said, you know, you've had some serious roles. How did you make the transition to comedy? And Tommy Lee Jones says, my secret to being funny in these movies is to stand as close as possible to Will Smith in every scene, which I liked. Now, I think he has his own talent, but his point is good for me this morning because he was saying that he looked funny because of Will Smith's talent, that somehow standing close to him, that talent reflected off of him. So I was thinking about that reflection that he was talking about. Or how about this story, this kind of classic exchange that sounds cliche until I lived it out one day, which is two parents coming home and both a little tired, both a little frustrated, trying to set the energy of the day behind to be home together. And I get the stare from my wife who says, you won't believe what your son did today. It's our son. I'm thankful. But you won't believe what your son did today. All of a sudden there's a world of difference. All of a sudden that reflection that she perhaps sees of me and him is the problem. So I was thinking about these things that get reflected, particularly when I read our story in Exodus, Exodus 34. If you look back just a little bit, the 32 and 33 of Exodus are really quite problematic. Moses goes up the mountain in chapter 32, and what do the people do? They get bored and they make idols. Aaron, his brother, is all too happy to help melt gold and make a fat calf. They're just having a party. And in verse 7 of chapter 32, Yahweh says to Moses, God says, go down at once, your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. Your people. This goes on for a time, and in verse 11, Moses says, O Lord, why does your wrath burn against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt? It's repeated. Chapter 33, the argument continues. Moses and God talking back and forth about the people of Israel who are a problem. And finally, Moses adds to it in chapter 33, verse 11. He says, let's see. Well, 12, he says, see, you have said to me, bring this people up. You have said, you will let me know whom you have sent me with me. You have said, I know you by name. So he's reminding of the relationship. And finally, on down into that story, Moses says, do you not remember in verse 13, he says, do you not remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He's enriching the conversation in 32:13. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Israel, your servants, and how you swore to protect them. So finally, the conversation turns. The people are being seen differently. They have been, if you will, transformed. They have been viewed differently. On a dime, it can change. On a dime, this miracle of birth, this gift of love, this child that we saw come into the world is all of a sudden your child. Your child, you won't believe what your son did today. You won't believe what your people did today. They made an idol. They are worshiping a false god. In a moment, it can change. So we have to look more deeply. We have to look more thoroughly. And fortunately, in this world, we have the gift of God's light, of God's glory. Now, glory is an odd thing to think about. It's a little like wind. You know it's there, but you can't really touch it or see it because glory is the light, is the light of God. And so I was trying to think about that this morning, and I brought a mirror, which you can see has a little bit of light to it because it reflects the light. But if you take a great and powerful light source, then shine, is that heading where I want it to head? All of a sudden it's much brighter. All of a sudden the glory is dramatic. And God's glory radiated so brightly off of Moses that it was a problem. He had to wear a veil to protect those around. He covered his face because the glory shone so brightly. What would it be like to be so close with God, so in with God, to have these kind of conversations, that we shone a little, that we were a little brighter, that suddenly our faces had a radiance, our eyes a twinkle, that somehow people saw a light in us that they couldn't explain. Israel reflects that holiness through Moses, but also Israel being God's people. It is hard to know what to do in the presence of such glory. That glory is bright and overwhelming. It's a little scary. Moses really in this story becomes a little, I think, at least to my reading, isolated. When Moses had finished speaking with him, he put a veil on his face. What would that be like to have to walk around sort of hidden? Now that changes, but what does it mean to reflect God's glory for you and for me? People that I relate to a little bit, at least, in the New Testament, Peter, James, and John are a terrific trio. Peter is very important, being the rock on which Jesus will build the church. James and John, loving and close. So they set off on an adventure. They're going up the mountain to pray. They don't know much else that's going to happen. But while they're there, they're overwhelmed because they have this vision. They see Jesus standing with two other figures, Moses and Elijah. It said in verse 31, they appeared in glory, that light is coming off of them. Now, how did they know Moses and Elijah? They didn't have a picture. They didn't have videos. Moses, the lawgiver. Elijah, the prophet with the robe. And Jesus there in his place right with them. But Peter, James, and John are oddly struck. This reading in Luke says they were weighed down with sleep, but they had stayed awake and they saw the glory and they weren't sure what to do. They were probably overwhelmed, not clear what that meant, not sure what to do with this vision they had had, this transforming moment. Because all of a sudden, this man that they had seen and truly had changed their life already, Jesus had called them out, they had acted. This is well into the ministry. But it's one of those moments where he is fundamentally different from this point forward. They will not look at him again without thinking of this at some point. So what do they do? Peter's instinct, I think, is perhaps the instinct of a lot of us maybe. He wants to absorb it, to process it. At least these are words that I'm putting into the story. He says, let's stay here. Let's build 3 booths. Let's build 3 dwellings. One for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for you. That's a pretty good idea. Go to the mountaintop. You could have pilgrimages. You could bring people up. You could tell them of the experience. This might work. But then an odd thing happens. This cloud descends. And in the cloud is a voice. And the voice says, this is my son with whom I'm well, my chosen. Listen to him. I'm sorry, I started quoting something else. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And what follows is Jesus standing alone and them leaving. Because the call is not for them to stay where they are, but to move forward. And that's not always easy. Sometimes we want to stay where we are, to keep things as they are, to not change it, but to dwell in it, to live in it, to absorb it even. But the movement was forward. Jesus walked, and they followed. I remember a few years ago, after Hurricane Katrina, I led a mission trip down to Biloxi, Mississippi with a group of men from my church, and we stayed on the grounds near those work sites on a campsite that had been set up by the PDA, the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance Group, and they had done a phenomenal job. They had talked to the community leaders right after the storm. They had gotten a softball or a baseball field or something and put up sort of a tent village, these really nice ones with the little some wooden flooring and cots. They had a tent, a kitchen, and we used that for worship as a group of volunteers. They had these semi-trailers that they had brought in with all these supplies, and they would open them up, and you could get hammers and things and belts to wear, and it was wonderful. And every night after we had gone out into the community to visit people in their homes or to help rebuild homes or to flat out build homes, we would gather and eat and worship and play anything from frisbee to ball, and they had some silly games that were fun for all the volunteers, and I thought, this is wonderful. This is terrific. And we were there for a week, and as that week came to a close and we could count what we had done, which was substantial, several of us had been plugged into programs already active, and we had done a full week's work, maybe a week and a half each of us. I thought there's so much more to do. It wasn't just weeks or months, but a year or 2 or more that needed to be done, and I thought we could just stay here. We could keep going. This is a terrific place. But we couldn't stay. We had commitments at home. We had family. There were other volunteers coming that wanted our tent. But I understood a little Peter's instinct to stay. Because in those conversations with the volunteers, we saw a spark of joy in the service of the Lord. In those conversations with the families, we saw this hopeful light of a new day. Having lived through a horrific storm, they were hopeful for what was to come. And we wanted to stand and bear witness to that, to stay in place. But such was not the case. We had to move on. And we did. How do we carry forward after seeing something that changes it forever? Because in that group, each of us had been our own person back home, but I hadn't really understood just how talented a builder Ron was until we got down to Mississippi. And there that night, that first night, they said, now we've got all these projects, and let me give you a thumbnail on each of them and it'll help you describe. And they were talking, and Ron said, well, you know, I've done that. And they said, oh, really? And he said, yeah. He said, I've been a contractor for all these years. And so he headed up a crew that week. And another man, Dave, was so knowledgeable that they began using him to do the inspections. And another gentleman had done plumbing. And so we all began to be farmed out. I am very good on a construction site about lifting and toting. And so a lot of my work on the crew was to lift and to tote, which needs to be done. I did also do some pastoral visits with families. But it was an amazing experience. And we, as a group, changed. We came differently oriented and went home united, having this shared experience of this cot that really was quite nice for a service camp, but quite uncomfortable by the end of the week. We had shared experiences that were life-changing, and nothing would seem the same after. We were transformed through the power of service in Jesus Christ. And it makes us different today. It reminds me of the power of service in Jesus' name. How do we see differently once we've seen the glory of the Lord reflected through the others around us? Excuse me, I talk about my family. So I'll tell you one more story, which was once we went to see my Aunt Jessie, and when I say aunt, she's really my great aunt. She was my grandfather's sister, and she was in her 70s when we went to see her, and she had this was 30 years ago, and she'd had a bad knee, and because of that, she'd leaned on this other knee, and while she'd had surgery on the one knee, the other one had given out, and so she was going back in. So here she was at her early 70s, having had one knee transplant, needing a second knee transplant. We showed up at her home, and I remember she had this big glass window on her back porch door where we had knocked, and she came around with a walker, and that leg didn't go straight down. It did about an odd angle in a way that a knee doesn't go. And I just hurt for her. And I was so sorry. And I saw this sort of elderly citizen who was in poor health. And then she opened that door and she said, come in, you look great. It's so nice to see you. I'm so thankful that you've come to see me today. I'm so blessed. And Aunt Jessie began to visit with us, and she would take interest in whatever we had done. I say we, my mother and I had traveled together. So the mundane parts of our lives, Aunt Jessie was interested in and asked questions. She had made little treats for us and showered us with food during the visit. And I sat there fascinated by this woman who clearly had such problems and some discomfort, because while we spoke, she kept shifting the knee she'd had operated on. She kept shifting the knee that needed surgery. She was in a bad way. But what was most true was not the physical discomfort or her state of health. What was the most true was that this giant energy of love and caring and attention radiated from her person. And for her, it was based in a lifetime of faith, one that had been raised in the church and taught in the church, an understanding of Christ with her always, no matter what. And somehow, during that conversation, she was transformed in my eyes, not from this person who was certainly still in need of physical care, but to this other reservoir of great faith and service, of great love and teaching, someone from whom I could learn. And it was the classic transfer where, we thought we were helping out by visiting, and she was tending to us, and we were transformed even as she had been. We basked in the reflected glory from her Savior, Jesus Christ, who had changed her life, and she offered us the chance to be changed through his power as well. Such is the power of the glory of God. When we follow Christ, our path is brightly lit. Such a journey does not guarantee safely. You need only look at where Jesus ended up. Such a journey does not promise earthly wealth. You need ask many believers only to know that to be true. But it is true that God's transforming love changes all that it touches, and that in the light of God's glory, we are frankly better. That in the brightest moment, such change is clear. And sometimes it is a challenge to remember how each of us look in the light of God's brightest glory, in that darkness of frustration and fatigue of anger, when we perhaps turn away and cannot reflect the glory. We need to recall that image that has been changed, because we have been made different, closer to God's image, brighter in the light of His glory. And for that, we are thankful now and forevermore. Amen.